Hi everyone, this is Erin. It's Saturday, October 8th, 2016, and today I got a letter in the mail and it's from Schaeffer Cox with 3 different stories, and I'll post them in 3 different videos. And this one comes complete with illustrations that are really beautiful. The first one is called The Way of the Sea. Justice Otter was not a terribly big creature. He was medium-sized and fit. His muscles were lean and he had a sharp eye and a quick mind. He was many things, but above all, he was an explorer. Several years before, Justice Otter had done what all explorers must do eventually. He set out to explore the sea. Justice Otter had a wife, Loyal Otter. They had a son and daughter, Brave Otter and Pretty Otter. Together they sailed the 7 seas in search of adventure, friendship, and new places. They had been through storms and doldrums. They had run their ship around in the night. They had been chased by cannibals in the jungles. One time they ran out of food and had to eat snails and slimy seaweed until a passing ship gave them fruit and sea bread. The otters never knew what tomorrow would bring, but they always found a way to get by. Life was grand and the world was theirs. Justice Otter was fearless. Sometimes he would get hurt, like the time he went diving for pearls and a shark bit his hand. There was also a time when he was captured by robbers in town. They beat him up, but he escaped with everything they had stolen from him, and then some. Every time something scary happened to Justice, he found a way to get through it. Justice Otter loved the sea because it belonged to no man. After being explored for thousands of years, it still wasn't tamed, and it never would be. 1,000 ships could sit on its surface under the watchful eye of 1,000 lighthouses, and the sea's proud waves would still roar and do as they pleased. The sea cannot be fenced, paved over, or barricaded. The sea bows to no one. It is wild. It welcomes all but succumbs to none. It is a beating heart moving the lifeblood of mystery from shore to adventurous shore. Justice Otter loved to stand on the bow of his vessel as it slipped effortlessly through the swells, silently pulled by the salty wind towards the next discovery. The sharp bow would slice through the waves, sending a frothy foam of bubbles and white water ahead of the boat a few feet. This bow wake would surge forward, then fall to the glassy surface with a musical sound as it was overtaken by the hull of the ship, only to be replaced by another jovial surge of frothy spray sea spray. Justice Otter stood with one foot on the bow pulpit, grasping the forestay with his hand. The scars from the shark bite were stiff and lumpy against the cold, abrasive cable. He thought of how grateful he was that that shark hadn't killed him. He gazed intently at the distant horizon. The sun was warm on his face. A tear welled up in his eye for the beauty of life at sea. The tear grew until it fell from his eye and rolled down his cheek to his lip. As he licked his lips, the tear was salty. It tasted like the sea. About midday, when the sun was warmest, the otters came upon Happy Little Island with a long sandy split that reached out into the rolling waves. As each of the slow, steady swells approached the shallows, it would rise above the rest, as if the ocean floor had reached up and tickled its belly, causing the whale to laugh and curl over like a piece of shaved chocolate. "Ho! What a nice gift the ocean has given us," said Justice Otter. This means we are meant to take a break to go surfing. Who wants to go with me?" Brave Otter could hardly wait. "I do, Daddy. I want to ride the nose of your surfboard." Justice Otter smiled a big, knowing smile as he pulled down the sails, rounded up into the wind, and gave the anchor a kick. The heavy anchor was clanky and clumsy on the bow of the boat. Justice heaved it over the roller and into the sea. The crystal clear water made a loud gulp as it swallowed the anchor. But once it was in the water, it glided downward like a string ray beneath the dancing reflection of the clouds. Justice paid out a good length of anchor line past the chain, and the boat settled onto its hook nicely. In one swift move, Justice tossed his surfboard over the rail and dove in. The board clapped down loudly, and a moment later, Justice surfaced, drawing in a deep breath as he lunged onto the board. Brave Otter was right behind. He jumped in, feet first, holding his nose. He made it over to the board and clawed his way onto his father's back as his little otter feet kicked furiously. "Here we go," said his daddy. Justice Otter made long, steady strokes with one hand after the other until they were gliding over the water at a good speed. Brave Otter could see the waves they were heading for, which looked a lot bigger from the surfboard than they did from the boat. Brave Otter clasped his hands tightly around his father's neck. "I love you, Daddy," he said. "I love you too, son. My favorite thing in the world is spending time with you," answered Justice with a warm, contented voice. As the two of them got closer to the break, the rumble and whoosh of the waves got louder and louder. Brave Otter got a flutter in his tummy as he felt a wave lift them up and suddenly fall out from underneath them. "That wasn't our wave." "Maybe the next one," said Justice. Brave Otter turned to look over his shoulder and saw a monster wave building. It seemed far away, but the bigger it got, the closer it felt. "Now! Get on the nose!" called Justice. Brave Otter scrambled to the front of the board as his daddy paddled faster and faster. His arms dug into the water and hurled it toward the wave that was bearing down on them. The sea started getting sucked out from underneath them. Everything, the whole ocean, the air, the board they were on, it was all being pulled toward the now towering wave. "If you go under, just hold your breath and keep kicking. You'll have to fight to get back to the surface, but you can do it," Justice yelled over the rumbling roar of the cresting wave. Brave Otter took a deep breath and held it as he tightly gripped the edges of the board. He wondered for a moment if this whole thing was a mistake, if he was about to get hurt bad. Ugh! But before he could finish his thought, the wave was upon them. They pitched forward. Brave Otter was now slipping off the nose while churning white water engulfed the tail of the board. Justice stood to his feet and took 2 quick steps backward. The board leveled, then dropped into the wave with a frothy chatter. It seemed now that the wave was standing still and the world was moving. Brave Otter let out his breath with a laugh. His daddy laughed with jovial delight too. Laughter is a language beyond words. It always tells the truth. It comes and goes as it pleases, and everyone speaks it. It was the language of the day that day. Father and son surfed and laughed until the sun was low. Then they returned to their boat, raised the sails, and rode the evening breeze westward. The wind had carried them far that day. By nightfall they had found a quiet, sheltered cove where they anchored up for the night. The air was still, and the shadows of night turned the water a deep inky blue. The reflection of their anchor lights flickered on the water like a firefly. The children were asleep. Justice Otter and Loyal Otter were getting ready for bed themselves when Justice took Loyal in his arms. "I love you," he said. "I don't ever want to be anywhere but here with my family." Loyal smiled and kissed him. "I love you too," she whispered. "Now be quiet so we don't wake the children." The next morning, Justice Otter awoke to the sound so awful and loud that he sprung out of his berth and hit his head on the ceiling. The boat shook and rolled to one side. The hull creaked and groaned. Broken glass rained down on Brave and Pretty Otter as a faint and unexcited voice from outside mumbled something about policy over a speaker. Their boat was being rammed by a bigger boat. Justice Otter grabbed his saber and jumped on deck. The bow of the bigger boat was plowing right into the side of the boat where everyone had been sleeping a moment earlier. The deck was halfway underwater. Two weasels wearing green uniforms and masks were already on board. "Stop resisting, this is the policy," said one of them. "Get off my boat," yelled Justice, and at that the weasels lunged at him with their swords and clubs. Justice blocked the first swing with his saber, but the other weasel clubbed him from behind and put a black bag over his head. Justice was unconscious. Justice awoke several hours later. It was dark and he did not know where he was. It was damp and smelly. His back hurt. When he sat up, he found that not only were his hands and feet shackled, but there was a chain cinched tightly around his belly. It cut into his spine. "Hello? Is anyone there?" said Justice. A door opened and three weasels filed in. The shortest one yelled out, "Get up! Turn around! Face the wall! Don't look at me!" Justice did as he was told. One of the weasels put a black bag over Justice's head. "It's the policy that we do this," explained the weasel, as if that made it okay. They led Justice out of the room. "Where are we going?" asked Justice. "You're our prisoner now," explained the short weasel. "When the policy says so, we'll keep you in that cage for years and years." The weasels pushed, prodded, and dragged Justice on the deck of the ship and sat him in a chair. They pulled the bag off his head. The bright sunlight made him squint at first. As his eyes adjusted, he recognized the ship as the one that had rammed their boat earlier. His family was nowhere to be found. He hoped they were okay. Had they been captured and put in chains? Had they drowned? Were they able to escape? He thought of Brave and Pretty Otter sleeping in their beds the last time he saw them. An awkwardly fat weasel with little round spectacles emerged from a side door and stood in front of everyone. In a screechy voice she sang out, "The one who once was as we are but has ascended is now approaching. All rise in worship for the illustrious Big Weasel." Big Wheeze. Justice Otter's feet were shackled and his hands were cuffed tightly to his belly chains. The weasels on either side of him grabbed his elbows and urgently lifted him to his feet just as a pair of ornate wooden doors dramatically swung open. From the shadows into the light strolled a weasel who looked like any other weasel, except that he was wearing a wizard costume. He took a seat at the enormous desk, motioned for everyone to be seated, then slowly shuffled through some papers. Never looking up or making eye contact, he drolly mumbled a spell over the gathering. "We are here today in the matter of Justice Otter defendant. The defendant is presumed innocent until he is sent to prison for the rest of his life, which will happen later today. These proceedings are governed by our time-honored policy. Now, how much does the defendant owe?" A tall, thin weasel wearing suspenders stood up to address the big wheeze. His teeth were black and he talked out of the side of his mouth. He sounded angry. He pointed at Justice Otter with 2 fingers and growled, "This otter used a large ship to ram a smaller sailboat. He did it while there was a family sleeping inside. We don't know why he did it. Maybe he wanted to capture people and keep them in a cage and make them wear chains and put bags on their heads." Justice Otter jumped up. "Wait a minute," he yelled. "I didn't do that. That's what you guys did to me and my—" But before he could finish what he was saying, one of the weasels punched him in the stomach so hard that he could no longer breathe, let alone speak. Justice fell back into his chair. The big wheeze never even looked up from his desk. The weasel in suspenders went on. "This otter is dangerous because he doesn't believe in our policies. And I just thought of something else, too. He might tell lies and punch people in the stomach if they don't think the same way he does. He needs to be locked up." And with that, the weasel in suspenders sat down. The big wheeze, still staring blankly at his desk, spoke again. "Okay, thank you. Now I want to remind the defendant that these proceedings are for you. So if you have something to say, speak up." Justice gathered his strength. "Yes, I have a lot to say," he answered confidently. "All right, prepare the defendant to speak," said the big wheeze. The 2 weasels grabbed a spool of thin wire and began tightly wrapping it around Justice's mouth and nose. The big wheeze went on talking as the wires got tighter and tighter. "Everything we do around here is part of the policy. The policy makes sure that everyone is treated fair. The hallmark of our policy is everyone being given the opportunity to respond. Are the wires on his nose and mouth tight enough?" The weasels wrapping Justice's mouth shut nodded yes. The big wheeze, still not looking up from his giant desk, slumped back in his chair. "All right, you may question the defendant so that he can respond if he wishes," said Big Wheeze. The weasel in the suspenders leaned forward and laughed a soft and hateful laugh. Then he began to ask questions that felt more like accusations. You rammed a sailboat that was on an anchor with a family sleeping in it, didn't you? You picked on anyone smaller than you, don't you? He could not. The wires were cutting. You don't let others speak freely, do you? Justice tried to speak. He could not. The wires were cutting into his nose and mouth, causing him to bleed. This otter can't answer our charges. Besides, he's a bully and a liar. If what we say about him isn't true, he would have said so by now. I'm requesting that he be locked in a cage for the rest of his life until he dies. Justice Otter's eyes got wide and with panic. His mind began to race. I didn't do anything wrong. I'm innocent. This can't be happening. Who will take care of Brave Otter and Pretty Otter? I'm their daddy. They need me to give them hugs and kisses and read them bedtime stories. I don't even know if I'll ever see them again, he thought to himself. Justice tried to speak, but the more he tried, the deeper wires cut into his nose and mouth. He tried anyway until blood was streaming down his face. The blood on his lips was salty, like the sea. Big Wheeze began to slowly gather up his papers to leave. As he did, he cast another spell on the gathering. Our system is the best system in the world, and the policy is never ever wrong. We on this ship value what people have to say, even and especially dissenters. That's what makes us great. The policy says no ramming boats with bigger boats, and the defendant does not deny that he did that. And the policy says he should spend the rest of his life in a cage. It's not my decision. The defendant is turned over to the weasels to be kept for all of his life in accordance with the policy. Now let's go to lunch early today. The weasel in the wizard costume slipped back into the shadows, and the two big doors shut behind him with a thud. Justice collapsed with sorrow and cried. He loved his son and daughter so much, and he could never see them again now. His tears mixed with the blood, and he tasted again the taste of the sea. His heart felt hollow, and his mind felt numb. He sobbed as the weasels dragged him away. They took him below, removed the chains, then shoved him into a dark cell. The door screeched, then slammed shut behind him. The crash echoed through the darkness. Then all was silent. As Justice's eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw that he was not alone. There was another otter in the cell, another older than Justice, but still young. What happened? Asked the older otter in a soft, even voice. Justice stumbled forward. The older otter stood up to meet him. Justice could see that the older otter was lean and fit under his tattered prisoner's clothes. The older otter gently unwound the wires from Justice's nose and mouth. What happened? He asked again. Justice had blood in his nose and mouth. What happened? He asked again. Justice had blood in his teeth, and it hurt when he spoke, but he managed to form the words. They said I can never see my children again. At the sound of his own voice speaking such a horrible thing, Justice Otter felt weak and started to stumble. The older otter hugged him and held him close as he steadied him from falling. The older otter said nothing, for there was nothing to say. He too had been attacked. He too had gone to the big wheeze. He too had wept for his lost children. He knew the pain that was in Justice Otter's hollow chest. There was nothing to say. There was nothing to do. He lowered Justice to a mat on the little bunk next to his own and sat quietly by in understanding reverence. Justice did not sleep that night. His bed was damp with sweat and tears. He cried out between sobs, "My son! Oh, my son!" Morning came and darkness fled, but the sorrow clung to that cell like fog clings to a putrid bog. Weeks turned into months and months turned into years. Justice Otter began to function and regain his strength, but he still could not sleep well. He would jolt awake from a nightmare and found himself alone in his cell. He would try to jolt himself awake from the nightmare of his cell as he had the previous nightmare, but he could not. That cell, the loss of his family, it was all real. There was no waking up from that nightmare. Nonetheless, his mind refused to accept it, and the standoff continued. What was and what should be stood like gladiators toe to toe, neither willing to run, neither willing to fight. Justice resented the weasels who held him there. He hated the lifeless monotony in their faces as they fumbled through their meaningless tasks. Every few days the weasels would take Justice for a shower. They would order him to stand up and face the wall. Then they would enter the cell and cuff his hands behind his back. Each weasel said the same ridiculous thing when they were putting the handcuffs on Justice. "This is for your safety." Every single time they came, they would say this. They would then lead Justice down a darkened corridor to another cage, one with a drain in the floor. They would order Justice to step inside the cage and get down on his knees. Then they would order him to lie down face first on the cold, wet, dirty floor. The tiles gave off a smell like sour milk and rusting iron. The weasels would stand over him and remove the handcuffs, then back out of the cage and slam the bars shut. Once the cage was locked, a weasel with a fire hose would order Justice to stand and face the bars as he unleashed the freezing cold blast of the hose. "Turn around," he would order. The blast of the water would sting. It made Justice's skin feel like brittle wax. The hosing ritual would end with Justice being thrown back in his filthy cell, no cleaner than he was before. He was cold, exhausted, and humiliated, but try as they might and cry though he did, the little otter's spirit remained unbroken. Early one morning when Justice was still sleeping, two weasels came for him. There was a fat one and a skinny one. The fat weasel led the way. He sort of waddled when he walked, as if his hips were fixed in place. His skinny sidekick followed behind him with a somewhat bashful stroll. "It's time to get up," said the fat one, as he clumsily fumbled through his ring of oversized keys. Justice rose to his feet and straightened his tattered clothes. The fat one entered the cell, handcuffs in hand. As he approached Justice, he said with a tone of droning trepidation, "This is for your safety." Justice did not move. He looked at the fat weasel until he finally made eye contact. Justice saw a distinctive look in the fat one's eyes. It was self-doubt. The two of them paused, eyes locked, for only a fraction of a second, but to them it felt like forever. Justice broke the silence. "Those aren't for my safety," he said, matter-of-factly. The fat one stared at him, unable to answer. "Those handcuffs, they aren't for my safety. You can lie to yourself every time you put them on me if it makes you feel any better about what you're doing. But you're not lying to me. I don't believe the lie you say out loud to yourself every time you come in here. Those are not for my safety." The fat one rocked side to side for a moment, then said apologetically, "Well, this is the policy. I don't know, I just obey the policy. That's all I know." Justice glanced up at the skinny one, clearly the smarter of the two weasels. He would not return Justice's gaze. The fat one ratcheted the cuffs around Justice's wrists. "I know that's all you know," said Justice in a genteel voice. "I know that's all you know." The pair of weasels led Justice to a small room, removed the cuffs, then ordered him to stand with his back to the wall, facing them. The fat one grabbed the bag, held it open in front of him. Then he spoke. "Take off all your clothes and put them in this bag." Justice just looked at him. "This is policy," the weasel continued. "It's a security inspection." Justice raised one eyebrow, looked at the bag, then back at the fat weasel. "Is that what the big wheeze told you?" he asked. The two weasels looked at one another, but said, his illustrations are great. He said nothing. Justice sighed, removed his clothes, and put them in the bag, then just stood there, sure-footed, back straight, head held high, as naked as the day he was born. The weasels were clearly embarrassed. "Okay, now turn around and—" The fat weasel mumbled something, but Justice could not make out what he said. "I can't hear you," said Justice, with a strong voice that came from deep in his chest. "Turn around so I can make sure you aren't hiding something in your butt crack," said the fat weasel. Perhaps it was the shy, mumbly way the fat weasel said it, or perhaps it was the way the skinny weasel was staring at the floor, but something about the situation made Justice start to laugh, just to himself at first, but the more he laughed, the funnier it became. "Come on, it's the policy. We just need to make sure there's nothing in your butt crack," said the fat one. Justice burst out into laughter. "What are you looking for, your human dignity?" said Justice as he turned around and bent over. "Because I'm afraid you lost that for good a long time ago." Justice looked over his bare shoulder at the two red-faced weasels and laughed some more. "Don't you get it, you morons? The joke's on you. It's all Big Wheeze. He's not using you to control me. He's using me as an excuse to control you. If he can get you to come down here every morning to be mooned by prisoners, he can get you to do anything." The fat one looked up and to the left, as if he was spontaneously inspecting the crumbly ceiling. This is just the policy, okay?" he said, in a tone that seemed to subtly distance himself from the whole affair. Justice spun around and stood up. "There is no policy," he boomed. There's just a crook in a costume making stuff up as he goes. The cloaks he orders in bureaucratic euphemisms. He cloaks his orders in bureaucratic euphemisms so you don't have to think about what you are being told to do. And he gives you feel-good lies to repeat to yourself. The fat weasel stammered for words but couldn't reply to Justice's thunderous declaration. The room fell calm as the weasel stood silently before naked Justice. The skinny one pulled at his shirt collar. Though it was buttoned to the top, it hung loosely, gaping below his pointed, bony chin. It was Justice again who broke the silence. "If you two weasels don't believe me, why don't you go ask Big Wheeze for yourself? I'm sure he'll set you straight." The two weasels looked at one another. The skinny one spoke first in a low caution tone. "Maybe we should look into this. You know, just asking a question, that's all." There was another stretch of silence, more awkward than before. "Well, okay, I suppose that's what we should do. You wait right here until we get back," said the fat one with a newfound purpose. And with that, the pair of weasels tossed Justice his clothes and bumbled out of the room. No sooner had they left the room than Justice noticed that the big ring of oversized keys had been left hanging in the door. He lunged at the opportunity, but thought fast. He knew they would soon return looking for the keys. Justice, still naked, swung the heavy steel bars shut. The loud screech and clang of the bars made Justice wince. If someone heard him, he would be done for. But this was no time for trepidation. This was a day that called for moxie. He reached through the bars and held them tightly shut as he twisted the key, locking himself in the cage. He then removed the keys, working with swift and methodical efficiency. He pried the keyring open and worked the key to his cell around the loop until it snapped loose. Sweat beads formed on his brow, but his breath stayed slow and even. He bit the precious key in his teeth as he reached back through the bars with both hands and tried each one by one until he found one that fit in the keyhole. He left the keys there, hanging in the locked door, minus the actual key to his cell. Justice quickly got dressed and hid the key in his sock. He wiped the sweat from his brow and took a deep breath. Justice curled up in the corner and tried to sleep. Some time later, a thud followed by a strange voice floated through the darkness. A door opened, flooding the corridor and cells with light. 3 figures stood in the doorway, silhouettes illuminated from behind. Their movements caused long, regular columns of light to jut into the dank, dark cells like a hand groping blindly under a desk. As the 3 figures came closer, Justice could see that it was the fat one and the skinny one. The third he did not recognize. He was small, no larger than a child, though his face was fat and droopy. The light struck his face as he turned, giving Justice a better look. He was bald on top with some stiff waves of black shiny hair just above his ears. His lips hung loosely to one side. He looked subtly confused as his eyes drifted back and forth, as if he was devising the next step in a long line of deceptive treachery. He walked with strides that were awkwardly large for a weasel of his size, though they were still smaller than a normal stride of anyone else. Without a word, Justice could tell this one had pride, but it was not pride that was his own. It was borrowed pride, the most dangerous pride of all. The three weasels walked to the end cell where the fat and skinny ones turned to face the light. Justice held back a gasp as they turned. They were badly beaten and had wires wrapped around their nose and mouth. The short one spoke to them. He slurred his speech and wagged his head from side to side. The distorted words dribbled off his lips like thick drool. You have been placed under investigation to assess whether you pose a threat to the safety and security of the institution. I cannot tell you how long you will be here, but the policy authorizes the use of other means necessary if it is determined that you could pose a threat, now or at a later time. And with that, the short little weasel ordered his fellow weasel into a cage. He slammed the door shut, which took all of his strength, then looked about frantically for the keys. Spying them hanging in the keyhole of Justice's cell, he moved for them. As he drew the keys from the slot, Justice stepped into the light. Looking him in the eyes, Justice whispered, "So, you're locking your friends up now. Who's gonna lock you up?" Startled, the little weasel jumped, then shot back. "I'm not locking them up because they are my friends. The policy dictates the procedures for an investigation. I cannot question the policy." Justice chuckled. "You can't question the policy, eh? How do you know that?" The question tumbled around in a little weasel's head like ice in a blender for a moment or two before he answered, or at least tried to answer. "Without enforcing the policy, everyone would just do whatever they wanted to do." This disconnected statement of fact in no way answered the question of why the little weasel couldn't question the policy. Nonetheless, the little weasel rocked back on his heels with a slopey grin of self-satisfaction. Justice folded his arms and scratched his chin. People everywhere just doing what they want to do. What a nightmare. I'm sure glad you have these cages." The little weasel was not very smart, but he was smart enough to know Justice was making fun of them. He did not like this. The system and the policies were his life. They were his power and his identity. He believed in them because it was the only way he could believe in himself. He stood up on his tippy toes, poked out his little round belly, and proudly declared, "If the policy instructed me to burn all of the others alive in an oven, I'd do it, because the policy is the law." Justice was silent. The words of evil the little weasel had said were shocking, but not as shocking as the fact that he was so proud to say them. Justice stared at him with bewilderment and pity. "I'll die for the system, the policy, and bigwigs," shouted the little weasel. To this, Justice had no reply. The little weasel walked over to the cage containing the other two weasels and spun the lock with a key. The sharp clack of the lock shot through the dim light. He secured the keys to his belt and walked past Justice. The two of them locked eyes, but the stare was broken when at the same moment they smelled smoke. Justice grabbed the bars and peered into the light. The little weasel dashed towards the door. Justice quickly pulled the key from his sock and reached through the bars to unlock his cage. Justice coughed. A rolling layer of smoke now covered the ceiling. It was hot and burned his eyes. The key was stuck. Justice took a firm hold of the bars and shook the door side to side with all his strength. Flakes of rust and grime fell out of the latch. The smoke was growing thicker and thicker. He let out a yell as he twisted the jammed key with all his might. It twisted about halfway. Justice gave the door a kick, then twisted the key again. This time it gave way and the door opened. Justice ran onto the deck of the ship. Flames were already climbing up the wooden mast. Several of the neatly furled sails were already on fire. Across the deck, Justice saw Big Wheeze through the smoke. He had a torch and was setting more fires to the rest of the ship. Justice crouched behind a barrel to hide as he looked on. Big Wheeze knocked out the glass in a window, then tossed the torch through the gaping hole ringed by jagged shards. The interior of the room became visible as the flickering glow of flames grew brighter. Smoke poured out of the broken window frame like an upside-down waterfall into the sky. It was evening and the smoke disappeared into the dusky sky. Big Wheeze was hunched over and moved frantically in the firelight. With one foot on the ship's rail, he stood over a pile of canvas bags and sea chests. One by one, he heaved them over the rail onto the rowboat. The bags and chests were overflowing with treasure. One bag ripped as Big Wheeze lifted it. A glistening arch of gold, gems, and pearls shattered across the deck and into the sea. The gold and silver coins fluttered through the water, reflecting the light from the blaze as they traveled down into the blackness that would soon receive the entire ship as well. Big Wheeze paid no attention to the loss. He simply grabbed the next bag and continued grumbling to himself as he loaded the rowboat. The bald little weasel came darting out of the giant double doors of Big Wheeze's chamber. His eyes were red and he coughed as he held a rag over his nose. "I was looking for you to save you. Quick, into the lifeboats," yelled the little weasel. But as the little weasel stumbled through the smoke, he saw the rowboat loaded with treasure and Big Wheeze slinging the last chest over the rail. Astonished and confused, the little weasel walked up behind Big Wheeze. Without a word, without a sound, without a break in his rhythm, Big Wheeze spun around and stabbed a cold saber blade into the little weasel's gut. He sank and stabbed a coal into He sank it to the hilt until the full length of the long curved blade emerged from the little weasel's back. Justice gasped and felt a tingle in his fingertips as he watched the blade run the little weasel through and shine in the glow of the flames. The blade was wet, but somehow not bloody. The little weasel grabbed Big Wheeze's forearm with both hands. The little weasel tried to scream, but only a silent breath rushed out of his open mouth. He tried to draw in another, but he could not. The breath was to be his last. He felt as cold as ice. He gazed into the face of the Big Wheeze. He could smell his sweat and breath. Their faces were only inches apart, but Big Wheeze never looked into the face of the one whose life he was ending. He just put his foot on the little weasel's chest, and with one long smooth kick pushed him off the tip of the saber. The little weasel fell to the deck face down, his hands trembling in the darkness. Big Wheeze tossed the saber to the side where it clattered across the deck. Then he awkwardly tumbled into the treasure-laden rowboat and shoved off into the darkness. The flames were now soaring into the night sky. The ship was listing badly to port, and heavy chunks of burning rigging railed down on the deck. Justice narrowly dodged a heavy block and tackle as it crashed through the decking right where he had been standing. He took a deep breath and ran for the starboard rail. But as he was about to leap to safety, something stopped him. He just went stiff. It was the thought of the two weasels still below and how they would burn alive in their cages. Justice had no time to think. He turned and ran to the little weasel, flopped his limp body over, and struggled to free the keys from his belt. The lifeless face stared up at the burning ship. Justice, having freed the keys, paused momentarily in reverence, then, with two fingers as if pointing, gently closed the little weasel's eyes one by one. When he touched him, his words echoed through Justice's mind, "I'll die for Big Wheeze." A deep sorrow swelled in Justice's throat. Just then, the mizzenmast split with a loud crack, like a bolt of lightning. It crashed down to the deck. Justice ran into the now pitch-black corridor of cages. He heard no noise. He feared the weasels were dead. Feeling his way to the back cages, he called out, "Are you still alive?" No reply, but as he fumbled through the ring of keys, the weasels scrambled to the door. Justice was relieved to see them. He opened the door to the cage, and with a few quick twists each, he removed the wires from both of the weasels' noses and mouths. "To the sea!" "There's no time to waste," yelled Justice. The three of them ran on deck, flames licking their bodies. Justice squinted his eyes as the heat burned his nose and ears. He could smell his singed hair. Without breaking stride, Justice kicked off the rail and dove head first into the slate-black water. The cool rush enveloped his body. The clap of the initial splash turned to a gurgle, then to a low rumble as the cold pressure squeezed him tight. He arched his back and curved back toward the surface. Making short, fast kicks, he churned upwards until he broke through the waves and drew in a deep breath. The burning ship against the night sky was a spectacular sight. The moon was full and bright, and the stars felt like falling snow. The flames danced with fury, sending a stampede of glowing embers heavenward. Much to Justice's dismay, neither of the weasels had jumped ship. They both just stood there tottering on the rail. "Jump!" yelled Justice. "We never learned how to swim," they yelled back frantically. "What? Why not?" screamed Justice. "We were planning on staying on this ship," came the reply. "My goodness, are you serious? It looks like Big Wheeze took a lot more from you than just your gold and silver," shouted Justice over the roar of the inferno. "What do we do?" asked the skinny one. "Jump or burn." "Burn alive," retorted Justice with a firm voice. There was a moment of thought, then one after the other. The weasels splashed into the water. No sooner had they hit the water than they were each trying to climb the other to stay afloat. Justice, already a good ways off from the burning ship, called out to them, "You have to let go of others to swim. You can't stay afloat by sinking someone else. Come this way, come this way." It was no use. The two began to fight as they each clawed to take advantage of the other. The yelling turned to gasps and then to coughs and then fell silent. The weasels had each drowned the other, or perhaps they had each drowned themselves long ago. Justice floated on his back and kicked his feet, putting more and more distance between him and the blazing ship, which burned long into the night, until it was not but a faint glow on the horizon, and at last slipped beneath the waves. No trace was left of the mighty ship and its hollowed policies. All that remained was a few swirls of smoke that skimmed the surface of the silent deep like secrets told to a dead man soon to be forgotten. Justice gazed up into the great expanse of the night sky. The stars by which he had sailed many a summer night burned with a crisp brilliance that seemed to welcome him home. He turned westward until the North Star was at his left. He paddled lazily along the following sea as the following sea carried him toward the morning. "Tomorrow," he thought to himself, "if I will look for my son, tomorrow I will look for my son, and for my daughter, for my family." And with that, a salty tear rolled down his cheek and into the salty sea. Schaeffer Cox. I wonder when he wrote that. There's no date on that one. Hope you enjoyed the story, everyone. I thought it was great.